So that means I would now like to be quiet for a bit and to invite the panel to introduce themselves, because everybody's involvement in Edinburgh's Passion Play is alongside and woven in with many other roles that they held. We thought it was best if folks introduced themselves so that you can tell us what you think you want us to know about yourself, your involvement in Edinburgh's Easter Play in 2025, and your involvement in other work in theatre. So I think, shall we start at this end of the row? Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Hopefully this is working all right. Is the microphone working? Rory, that's great. Well, great to see everybody here. My name's Helen Bond. I'm Professor of Christian Origins here at Edinburgh University. My particular interest is in the Gospels and the characters of the Gospels and the historical and social situation of first century Galilee and Judea, the Romans, Pontius Pilate, the priesthood, that kind of thing. So I've done quite a bit of historical consultancy with documentaries and sort of TV dramas. So I've got quite a lot of experience from that angle. And I met Suzanne a few years ago, and my involvement with the play was sort of fairly minimal at first. I was just sort of going in and giving a little talk now and then about, what was life like in first century Judea. This year, I've had more involvement along with Shadab, who will say more about this. We've had more involvement in terms of reading the script and talking about the plot line and the masculinity angles. So, I'm very excited to be part of all of this.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, hi. I'm Sarah Parkhouse. I'm a researcher at the University of Manchester. I'm one of those people that don't know very much at all about the Edinburgh Passion Play, apart from having come to watch it a couple of weeks ago. My research, I'm really interested in the retelling of the Jesus story from antiquity to today. I mainly work on kind of ancient retelling, so from the Gospel of Matthew to late antique Gospels, and I'm really interested in kind of the continuities in the questions that are being asked with the same, the 21st century questions in the Passion Play. So things like power dynamics and gender dynamics, which we see right from kind of the first century. So I'm also working with Helen on a project funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh, who have given us a bit of money for this panel, on ancient and modern retellings of Jesus' life. So I'm here under that kind of scope. Oh.
Hi, my name is Suzanne. I am Artistic Director of Cutting Edge Theatre based here in Edinburgh, and for the Passion Plays I am the producer, director and the person that buys the bread at 9 o'clock the night before, or cleans the toilets in the morning, whatever is needed. But primarily I'm producer, director.
Hi, I'm Donald Smith. So my working life's all been in Scottish arts and culture, in particular interest in theatre and storytelling. So I'm the Netherwell Arts Centre, and then it became the Storytelling Centre, and I'm still connected in there. So over those years, I've been involved in many different versions of passion plays. I also have a special interest in the way arts and culture has bridged issues of faith and social change and morality and what's going on in wider society. A little personal, I was wryly amused to see myself billed as the Reverend Donald Smith, which I'm not. I don't mean I'm irreverent, but but it has a little relevance to today, because I came to this august institution as a postgraduate ordinand in 1978, and then I revolted and left very quickly because I felt there was a kind of, still, particularly in the ordinand community, a kind of conformity going on. Everybody wanted to get their dog collars and get on with the job. And actually, I thought we're on the cusp of the need for radical change here. And I switched over to Scottish studies. And I found there was a kind of sort of creative energy and a mood for change. Politics were hot topics at this juncture. And that began really a period of decades where there's been a sort of thriving cultural energy around Scotland, and it's been great to see the churches getting more and more involved in that.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shadab Rahmatullah. I'm a senior lecturer in Islamic studies here at the School of Divinity. I work on liberation theology, and I'm particularly interested in questions of gender and how manliness is constructed, how it's performed. And so that's my inroad into this play. And I had the pleasure of seeing the play last year, had some really fruitful conversations with Suzanne and Helen, and the rest is history.
And I'm just along for the ride. But we thought we'd start by hearing a bit, maybe first from Suzanne, and then see if others want to add a bit, about what it is to do a passion play today. We know that they have a very long history, a very long and complex history, which you might hear a bit more about later. But why do a passion play in 21st century Edinburgh? And what is it adding, what is it bringing to 21st century Edinburgh? And maybe it would, since you've been doing this for many years, it would be good to hear something about how you're thinking about that has been shaped by your experiences over the recent years.
Yeah, I think the fascinating part for it, for me, is the history. So being able to be, so I'm a community Christian and also work in theatre. So for me to be able to bring the two things together was just a delight and such a privilege. And I study a lot about the history of theatre, and all theatre is based on religious ritual. And people in this room will know this more than I know. So whether that's Western theatre and in the Greek theatre, whether that's Eastern, it's all based on religious ritual, all comes out of religious ritual. So I found that journey is fascinating. I'm not going to go through the history of theatre because it takes too long, but it has been a really interesting relationship between theatre and, let me just say, the church. Over the centuries, and we kind of have a bit of a love-hate relationship, and probably Donald will know more about this, but it's fascinating to see when it flips backwards and forwards, and there's been that tension, I think, all the time. But if you fast forward to the UK, and I can't speak Latin, I'm so sorry, but the first recorded piece of theatre we have comes out of the church, the Quem Quiritus. Hope I've got that right. And that was something that was spoken within a church building, and the congregation replied. It was about 2 sentences long, if I remember. And from that point on, so I remember Helen and I having this discussion about when was the first bit of theatre telling the gospel story. And actually, we were like, oh, not very sure. But, you know, when I'm talking about it, I always say the first way that they used the arts, the church used the arts to communicate the story was through stained glass windows. So it's through visual art. And there's a lot more history in visual art than actual spoken word in theatre. Somebody will probably correct me, but this is my understanding so far. And then what I found fascinating about that was when they had developed that within the church, and then they began to look at the plays as a way of telling what was a biblically illiterate society, the story of Jesus. That developed into the mystery plays, the early passion plays, whatever. And that became so big that it spilled out into the streets and had to spill out of the church into the courtyards, into the cities. And if you look at something like, I think it's the York mystery play, I'm looking at Jolly and he should be nodding or just going no if I'm right or wrong here. Then what I loved about it was they began to give sections of the Bible to people, like the fishermen did the boats or the fishing, or Noah or something. The candle makers did something. The bakers did the Last Supper or the feeding of the 5,000, that sort of thing. And I just found that fascinating, but that they were actually telling the story to a biblically illiterate society, but involving the community. And I guess that's what attracted to me. Now, why do we do them today? Somebody said to me last year, actually, we were part of a panel saying you shouldn't actually be doing these anymore at all because of the rise in anti-Semitism. And it just forced me to go back and go, why are we telling them? And I remember somebody that I was working with said, we are no longer See, we are no longer, yeah, we are not an illiterate society, but we are biblically illiterate. So actually the people earlier were illiterate, couldn't read the Bible, but nowadays we are biblically illiterate. So as a society, less and less people know the story. So for me as an artist, I want to tell the story. I'm not preaching, I'm not doing anything else, I'm just telling the story. It's up to the people out there to make up their minds. So sorry, that's a long-winded answer. I got it the wrong way around, but first of all, they were illiterate, and now we're biblically illiterate.
Can you, for those that haven't been involved in either helping to make one of these things happen or maybe even sing it, give us a little snapshot of what it's like. What would we experience if we were part of the journey of making this happen?
Yes, right. It's like painting the Forth Road Bridge. It literally takes a year to start and to do and just from the beginning to the end. So I get about a month off, and then I have to start again and just think about, all right, well, what are we doing? So a lot of the Passion Plays are the same. So people do the same play. So if you've seen the Wintershall one or the Trafalgar Square one or the European ones, there are hundreds in Europe, hundreds and hundreds of them in Europe. And they're all the same. It's the same play. And sometimes it's the same cast playing the same part. Now, I guess for me as an artist, that I didn't want to do that because that gets a little boring for me. And I didn't want the community cast that are involved in it to have that same attitude. Well, this is the part I play. And if somebody comes along and goes, well, actually, I quite fancy playing Pilate this year. And then you start getting on those little tensions. I don't want that. But so I made a rod for my own back, and I said, we will never repeat the play. We will not do the same play twice, is what I said. I wish perhaps I hadn't said that. But for me, again, as an artist, it is about looking at what's happening in society and having something to say within that societal framework. So I remember somebody, when I was training years ago, said, if you want to find out what is happening in any society across the world, don't look at government, don't look at the politics, go see what the artists are doing and how they are telling the story, because they are always on the forefront of what's happening in society. They know what is happening in society, and they are not afraid to speak out about what is happening in society. And so different people will use theatre or puppets or, visual, tons of things. But an artist should always be looking at what's happening in society and then considering what do we have to say about that as a society or as an artistic community. And so that's what I try and do. And that's kind of how we ended up with Shadab getting involved in, his idea of masculinity, which this time last year, roughly, was when we started that whole thing. And it wasn't as massive a thing as it is now. So, that the Andrew Tate thing hadn't happened, that all that stuff wasn't there. And I remember thinking, actually, I haven't told Shadab this, going, I don't have anything to say here. I don't know how to get into this play. This year's play was the most challenging one I've ever done, because I was like, I actually don't know what I have to say about this or what we have to say. And then everything started unfolding. So that whole thing of looking at masculinity and how Jesus was a more positive role model was something that I found fascinating with Ellen and Shadab unfolding.
I wonder if Donald, if you wanted to say, since you spoke earlier about moving out of the church context into the arts context because you felt that was where the change was happening, and that was this space of cultural creativity. And I wondered if you had any reflections on what Suzanne's just said in the light of that.
Sure. Well, I've watched with great interest the Passion Play project, and the key thing about it is it's endured, it's sustained, it's gone on evolving, and that, I have to say, is in the kind of climate in which theatre has to operate, is an astonishing achievement. And I remember it starting up, and I remember Cutting Edge, well, that wasn't yesterday. And I mean, that's one of the most interesting things to me is the way the script has gone on evolving, and therefore the performance has changed, and therefore the engagement with the audience has changed. And I think there's this thing, we'll get into this, but I mean, the way in which drama can articulate the gospel narratives, which are different, of course, is this kind of balance between the big structure, the big picture, like the passion narrative, the big structural things, and then what you might call the cameos and close-ups, where they're different in each of the Gospels. They're very different. You know, they can be starkly dramatic in Mark, very focused, very extended and reflective in John, and Luke's got this great storytelling and character portrayal thing. So we'll hear all of this. And I think for me, the really successful and interesting and stimulating thing about is the way that drama can pick that up and put across essentially the story. I'll stay away at the moment because there's going to be good discussion about the gender issue and portrayal, and I thought that was absolutely fascinating, and I look forward to discussing that. But that's broad picture.
I wonder if Shadab, you had a very distinctive experience with this, because if I recall you telling me correctly, you encountered this play and this approach for the first time a year last Easter, and saw something in that, some potential in that was you wanted to be involved, and then you've been really close to it all this year. So could you say something about your perspective on what this play is doing, what it is to be doing a play like this in 21st century Edinburgh?
Yeah, so I had the opportunity to watch the play last year, and it was actually Ramadan at the time, so I was fasting. And so when you had that interactive element where you passed out the bread when Jesus feeds the 5,000, I kept that piece of bread and I had it for iftar when I broke my fast. So for me, it was not simply an aesthetic experience as a non-Christian. It was actually a very spiritual experience as a Muslim who considers Christians as Jews as people of the book, Ahlul Kitab. And so that was my initial encounter with the play. And as I was watching the play, which focused on women in the gospel narratives, I was really struck by the way in which Jesus broke down in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? And the way in which this powerful, towering social critic just broke down like a child and was alone and was vulnerable. And it got me thinking about the role of masculinity in the gospel narratives, the way I've thought about questions of masculinity in terms of the biography of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And so that was where our conversation began, and we started thinking about that. We started thinking about questions of male experience, the diversity of male experiences, practices of domination, but also practices of submission, humiliation, rejection, and how that might play out in the synoptic narratives, right? So that struck me. And what also struck me was the reception of it. As a liberation theologian, we're interested in this really bougie thing called reception hermeneutics. So how does an audience consume a play? And it really struck me how influential that was. I was seeing families, there were 700 odd people there. I was seeing very impressionable young men and boys watching this play, and that got me thinking about the role of Jesus as a role model, not just for Christians, but for anyone in this very open public space that is Princess Street Gardens.
So there's all sorts of questions there about how this play as public theology, as well as around these specific questions of masculinity. Donald's raised this crucial issue about the way in which the story of Jesus has been told and retold, and the Jesus traditions have kept on being reshaped in relation to the concerns of a particular time. And I know that Helen and Sarah's particular interest is how far that goes back, and this question of the malleability of Jesus traditions. So I'm gonna throw maybe something as a slightly controversial viewpoint to start with, or not a controversial, but we did some audience surveys of the play this year, and one of the questions that we were asking, because we were interested in this for the Centre for Theology and Public Issues, was how people felt about this kind of retelling, this new script every year, of the story of Jesus. And we got some responses that are, yes, this is great, this is contemporary, this is bringing it up to date, like I said. And some saying, you can't do that, in fact, in different one words or another. So what do you say to those people, those voices who say this kind of reshaping of the story of Jesus is just wrong? It's against Christian tradition, it's against Christian theology, it's maybe even quite dangerous. As biblical scholars, you must hear that kind of challenge and get that kind of challenge. How would you respond to it?
Shall I have a first go and then pass on to you? We may well be saying similar things. Well, I would say to them, come to New College and do New Testament 1, and you will find the error of your ways. And I mean, that question was very interesting because what I think the vast majority of people who responded said was, yes, it's fine to sort of mess around with the story. You can add extra bits, you can tweak things, as long as you keep to the central tenets of Christianity. But then the question, obviously, is, what are the central tenets, and are your central tenets the same as my central tenets? And so that there does seem to be a general idea that it's fine to sort of mess around a bit, but you have to have, and I suppose it's something that has to be distinctively Christian or Jesus-like. You have to have certain things in the center that we all recognize. But of course, this idea of writing and rewriting goes back to the very, very beginning of Christianity. I mean, it's what we call redaction criticism. It's where Matthew has used Mark as a base and is then rewriting Mark, and Luke is doing the same. John perhaps is rewriting all of the previous Gospels. And to a large extent, it's inherent in the whole idea of the Gospels being biographical texts. You write biographies of people you think are interesting and important now, and because you think they have something to say to a present-day audience. And certainly in terms of ancient biography, you're trying to elicit an emotional response. You want to persuade them. There's a morality there. You want to sort of hold them up as an example. And I think everybody always automatically rewrites the story of Jesus. And that's before you've even started to think about actually doing it, consciously. So it does go back right to the very beginning of Christianity. I don't think there are any stories of Christianity that aren't adapted to a particular time. And that's exactly what you see with the Gospels. They're adapting it as the parousia doesn't come, as Christianity and Judaism becomes something different. They're adapting all the time.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. From Matthew rewriting Mark onwards, we've always had this art of retelling the Jesus story, and it's interesting to kind of think about whether this script of the Passion Play could even be called a gospel, for example, because it is. It is doing the same sort of work that the canonical Gospels and the non-canonical Gospels were doing. What I was really interested in was something that Suzanne just said about the retelling, but you're putting on these Passion Plays because of biblical illiteracy, but you're then retelling the biblical story and kind of changing it in some ways and emphasizing certain aspects and de-emphasizing other aspects, which is what I think all kind of non-canonical late antique Gospels were doing, and you're kind of doing the same thing. So it has the kind of central tenets, like a core message which has been there from Mark until today. And I thought that was a really kind of fascinating thing to kind of to grapple with in my brain. This kind of what is the core message and what can be shaped differently. Yeah, I'll stop talking there.
I'm thinking now I'm thinking as you say that about nativity plays,
Yeah.
right, and about how persuaded primary school children are that there is a donkey in the Bible. There must be a donkey in the Bible, because and obviously that's not canonical Gospels,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's or some of the animals. So I was interested in what Donald was saying about the cameos, and I wondered if you wanted to come back in on that.
So I want to be a wee bit wary of this sort of authoritative versions, right? Because the whole point of theatre and oral storytelling, and the way out of which theatre comes, is that it only exists in that performance, in that moment. So I would kind of argue that the theatre thing is not attempting to claim the status of being another gospel, but actually is a space of experiment. Yeah? And that's, to me, what came across very powerfully in this year's production was the experiment you've already referred to in the depiction of Jesus and his vulnerability and, flipping roles with the Mariam character around a sword shall pierce your heart also was suddenly something that was transferred to Jesus rather than something that Mary had been told. Now, I thought all that was absolutely fascinating. And I would sort of argue that hopefully people would come to a theatre space and an audience engagement with a sense that we're there to explore this story and that, we shouldn't be sitting like this thinking, is this right? How can I condemn this in the question here? I missed the question here. Sorry.
It totally works.
Can I just add, so I guess the fascinating thing for me as an artist and looking at the Bible is if you read bits in the Bible, it's the same for anything if you're adapting something, so forgive me, just talk about the Bible. But when you read, I always say this to the cast, when you read the crucifixion in one of the Gospels, it's a paragraph. It says factually what happened. And for me as a director, what I want to know is, what did they feel? What did that, so when I am directing, actually I don't direct the crucifixion scene. If they've done their character work, we do a lot of character work. I usually just say to the cast, just feel what you feel and your reaction will be real from that. I don't direct it unless I need them to be in a certain spot. But, when you go, well, what did it feel like for a mother to watch her son die horrifically in front of her eyes? And that's what our job as artists is to do, is to unpick that and to ask the what if question and then to look at the relevancy for today. So we always look at the relevancy. So the 2018 one actually was set against the backdrop of Ukraine. Was it 2018? 2021. Yes, post-COVID. It was the same play, but we adapted it. That's what it was. And so we set that against the refugees fleeing. But Afghanistan had just happened and then Ukraine just happened. So for me, when we were talking about a mother watching her son die, that had a very strong relevance. And what I guess I'm trying to do is get the audience to go, and I say this every single year to the cast, the characters whose story we are telling were just ordinary people to whom something extraordinary happened. So moving Jesus aside, because he was extraordinary. But everybody else, these are just ordinary men and women like we are. That's all. And so we have to get under the skin of those people, because what we're trying to do as storytellers is to enable the audience to see the relevance to today. So I would say when theatre works, it's when we either see our own lives mirrored on a stage, or we go, oh, I know what that feels like. So I want every mother in an audience to go, oh, that must have been heart-wrenching from her to watch her son die. Or Peter to go. So I've done versions of this play in prisons across the world. And when I'm doing the prison, they say, we can't do this. And I go, all right, put your hands up if you've ever betrayed anyone. And usually the whole room go, ah. Okay, so you know what it's like to play Peter then. Let's just crack on. So that's what it's about. That's when theatre, for me, really works. It's when an audience can come out and go, I know what that's like. And therefore, the character of Jesus is more relevant to me today because I understand him. He doesn't have a halo around his head. He's not walking around going, it's all okay because I'm here now and I'm wearing a white T-shirt. It's not about that. It's about portraying, I've done those plays. It's okay, I can say that. It's about portraying a Jesus who is the same yesterday, today, and always. And the challenge for me is to find those.
I'm hearing something really interesting in the way this has shifted from a focus on the text and the script to a focus on the event of the performance. And I did wonder whether Helen or Sarah wanted to say anything about that relationship between the written and the oral, or the performance, the relationship between the text, which is what you're largely working with, and the spoken word, particularly given the histories of gospel texts. I don't know.
Should I go first? Okay. I was thinking the exact same thing, actually. And Suzanne, I assume you wrote the script. Because you
primarily with with Helen and Shada, we set out an outline, and then we devised with the cast, and then I write. And actually, this year's script, I took so much artistic license that I thought I'd flee the country with it. And the same with the 2021, actually, because I did Jesus in the first person. And I thought I was going to be probably hung, drawn, quartered at that point when Jesus said, I felt the X, Y, and but I've survived. I've lived to tell the tale.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. I was asking because you introduced yourself as the producer and director, but not the writer. And because I am interested in textualization, things which turned into text at some point, or were text and then became performance. I thought that was curious that you kind of left that bit out. And I mean, it feels like, for me, I mean, I did watch it, but it is also a text. I have it here, I have the script on my lap. And it's the same kind of way we can think about other Gospels. They may have started as oral traditions and then were written down, things became text and then live on. They're not then just a moment in time or a single performance. So I'm always going on about continuity here, but there is continuity from antiquity to today in the kind of way that this Jesus story becomes the written word, I guess.
No, so why I didn't say writer is because it's quite a collaborative, working with Helen, and I don't like to take credit.
But you did by far the most.
and also the cast are part of devising, so I mean, ultimately I was the person that kind of sat there and took all that stuff and put it together. And if you think of the first writers, actually, if you look at my script, because I retain the original script all the way through rehearsals, I don't get a clean copy. I've literally just printed off the clean copy with all and that document is absolutely full of scoring outs and cuts and changes and everything. So maybe they did the same, I would love to see their
we
first
can tell
draft.
that they did from all the textual stuff. And I mean, that's true because it was an evolving script right to really quite late. And Pilot over there is laughing because I know there was a line sort of there changed and, we can't say that and let's move this around. But so I can absolutely testify to that. But I also wanted to say that I think we tend to think of the Gospels now as, text. They are entirely text. But for, New Testament people, scholars of the New Testament, they're not just text. They were encountered orally. People would have heard them read out, possibly quite dramatically. I'm working on Mark's crucifixion narrative at the moment for an essay, and it's amazing how theatrical that is. There's so much look all the time. And I think it's sort of playing with the Roman ritual of the triumph, and there's lots of tragic elements in Mark's gospel. So it does seem to me that it's by its very nature theatrical, and people would have experienced this, hearing it, seeing it in their mind's eye. So, it's not that far away when you see it like that to what we're talking here about, performance and a space and something that you go away and think about, and you have no access. Most people, anyway, they have no access or no ability to read a text.
I think Shada might want to come in, yes?
Yeah, can I just echo Helen that Suzanne did by far by far the bulk of the work. And this is a collaborative project, and this is something that CTPI was very interested in, is how this was a collaboration between academics and artists. And I'm very grateful to Suzanne for learning so much from you in terms of what script writing means. I'm thinking about the scene of Jesus' rejection at Nazareth, and we went back and forth, and it was such an iterative process. You're like, Shadab, you're telling, but you need to show me, and we're going back and forth. And this was very, very enriching for me, and I really am grateful for that, so thank you. I just wanted to go back to this idea. I'm not going to enter the debate of whether this is the Gospel of Suzanne or not, but it's not just how a text is classified, but what is the context in which it is read, right? And what are the stakes of that context? And connecting that to the play, what does it mean to hold a play that is free, that is unticketed, and that is performed in a land that is the commons, right? It is not a private space. It is open to all. And you are beholden to the community of that space. And in that sense, I think that public theater innately speaks to social concerns because it is already connected to society and owes society. And in that sense, I found it to be very easy to think about this script in ways in which we could address social concerns, in particular masculinity, and we'll get to that a bit later. But I didn't feel that it was forced at all. I thought it was actually what it was meant to do because that was the space in which it unfolded.
So I'm quite keen to give people some time to speak about the theme of our masculinity. So I wondered if we could move on to that now. So a certain number of people in the room have been closely involved in the play or have seen the play, but I wondered if maybe actually, Shadab, maybe you want to start with this again. What do you think were the key features of the play that spoke to modern anxieties about masculinity? So we've heard a few already. We've heard about Jesus and vulnerability, but there were some other features as well that you might want to just draw our attention to.
Yeah, I'm mindful that it's become very popular now to speak about masculinity. It's great to hear the former England gaffer, Gareth Southgate, speaking about it. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Netflix series Adolescence, which is superbly made. But this is something that we really began thinking about last year. And the trick to this play is really situating it in terms of the theme of the prior year. The theme of the prior year was about centering women in the narrative. And I think the trick of really solid feminist masculinity studies is to think critically about manhood without bringing the attention back to men and provincializing women again. So how do we do that? So in a space that is discursively and materially gender equal or moving towards gender equality, how does the role of men begin to shift and transform, right? Both in terms of norms, but also on the ground practice. And these are the questions that we tried to tease out in the script in different ways. How are men relating to women? How are men relating to children? What does it mean that Jesus is so comfortable around children and is able to melt in front of children and that children gravitate towards him? We have a scene in which Peter is having a conversation with his son Joshua and has difficulty using the word love in that conversation, right? Because it's not manly enough. And of course, we talked about how men relate to other men as well, right? And so this is what we're trying to tease out. So in a gender equal context, or a relatively gender equal context, how would men's roles change? One way in which we tried to play with that question was to think about, to what extent do men value housework? To what extent do they value work in the private sphere, whether it's cooking or cleaning or childcare, all of this labor that has been invisibilized and historically undertaken by women, right? So one of the scenes in the play that we have is Jesus is ministering to Mary. Martha's in the kitchen. Martha's like, Mary, come help me. Jesus is like, Martha, always in the kitchen. And Martha doesn't take it. Martha rebukes Jesus. Jesus has a conscientious pause. Jesus enters the kitchen and says, teach me. Right?
And they make bread instantly, which is just weird, but never mind.
Creative license. And my favorite scene is actually when Peter comes in and he's like, what are you doing? This is women's work. And I thought this was a really important moment because for most men who challenge gender norms, you look down then. There's shame. You've been shamed. But instead, Jesus throws some dough at Peter and says, come join me. If you're hungry, you're hungry. Right? And then Peter joins him and they start doing it together. And we did a survey, 120 folks responded, and that was the scene that really stuck for a lot of folks because it shook them up a bit. They hadn't thought of Jesus that way. They were mindful and fully aware that this wasn't in the synoptics. They knew that, but they didn't think of Jesus that way. And so these were the type of questions, non-sensationalist questions of everyday practice, which frankly is the most important question that we're trying to engage in the play.
We need to talk about Barabbas, though. We need to talk about Barabbas. Does anybody want to talk about Barabbas?
Yeah, I mean, just the whole, I said at the beginning, this was one of the hardest ones I've ever done because I couldn't find my way in. I couldn't find my way into this for ages. And initially in our discussions, I thought the way to do it is to mirror him with another character, Jesus with another character. I thought Pilate, because he was a man of power and control. Then it was going to be the centurion, and I just couldn't find it. And then we had done a scene with Barabbas a few years ago, putting Jesus and Barabbas in the cell together. And I went, that is the man, and that we mirror Jesus. So Barabbas's journey goes on, and because we talked a lot in the cast and we rehearsed about toxic masculinity and went, it's not that, that's not what this is about. So there was a lot of discussion around that. But Barabbas was the perfect character to kind of have him go on the journey. And if you saw the play, so he starts off being quite violent and quite, this is the way that we have to do it because it's the only way to come join us, Jesus, you be part of our group. To not understanding through the prison cell conversation through spoiler alert if you haven't seen the play, but right at the end when they take Jesus off the cross and they put him in the arms of his mother, and then the disciples try to pick him up and take him away, and they can't. They can't. And Barabbas says, "Here, let me." And it was one of the most moving bits for me, actually, when, and we're very fortunate with David, who plays Barabbas, who had worked out to do this in the gym for ages. And he picks up Jesus and flings him over his shoulder and takes him away. And I knew that people expecting a beautiful burial and stretcher and everything might be a bit horrified. But I always remembered Helen saying he might have just been thrown into a common pit. So that's what I tried to get to that sense. But, in rehearsal, that whole thing about trying to navigate our way around not offending all the women, I was like, every time we say, that's women's work, all the women in the cast were like, ooh, And actually we kept that in that scene, in the bread making scene, which I think was your suggestion, the bread making scene should have. Because every time Peter said, that's women's work, the cast just went, we just can't say that. And so we kept it in, and the cast on the day all go, ooh, no, there were other points we had that, but we felt it was a bit overkill.
I think Donna wants to come in. I know Helen wants to say something about Barabbas, so I'm keeping that as a...
So we'll knock it along. So, not having been majorly briefed on the masculine theme, but vaguely having that in my mind, I still think my strongest impression about the script and the play was the power of the women characters. I think that's still utterly central and very strong and very original and creative. I don't mean these things that were done around the male characters were uncreative, but were interesting. And it's interesting, there are 17 articulated female characters, and there are 10 male plus 2 token Roman guards. And I just, again and again, I was really impressed by those kind of cameo, and I've not mentioned yet also the use of voiceover very challenging, obviously, the acoustic, but the using voiceover is a very creative idea, so it could take us into somebody's inner perspective. And again, that was very strong in women characters. And you know, it was quite tough going because a lot of these blokes were pretty bloody hopeless. Actually, I don't mean their acting skills here, you know. It's just there was a lot of, you know, confined, and of course that was part of what was being portrayed, confined within kind of stereotype, sense of what the masculine role was. So it's interesting. It's probably something maybe could go further, and I think the depiction of the Jesus character is kind of central to that kind of process. So it's interesting. So I don't think you could simply say this was the year of the men. Yeah. That's it.
It's interesting you say that, because I was one of the people, I mean, a lot of people here were doing surveys afterwards, and one of the first people I surveyed, it was a sort of a man in sort of middle age, and I said to him, you know, what did you think of the masculinity side? And he said, I didn't notice any masculinity, it was full of women, there were women everywhere. So, I mean, and maybe it was partly, as Shadad says, a sort of a throwback to, you know, the previous years and all the learning, all the good stuff that had happened, possibly too the fact that maybe more women come forward to be actors and actresses in these things than men too. But yeah, I mean, and I think the thing is, you know, when you read the script, it's very, very obvious, the masculine side of things. I think to some extent watching it, and particularly we were unfortunate in having some of those sound issues. You know, some of that, maybe some of the more subtle bits perhaps got a little bit lost. But for me, I mean, what's really interesting about Barabbas and these characters is that, you know, the way that the masculinity of Jesus is portrayed is partly by those scenes that Shadab has mentioned, but also partly by contrasts. So, and again, this is exactly what you get in the Gospels. You know, Jesus and Barabbas are contrasted. Jesus and Peter are contrasted. And the contrast with Pilate too. I mean, you know, that sort of the way Pilate treats his wife is a very strong contrast with the way that Jesus treats all the women in his orbit. And so, you know, the idea is that maybe you go away and think about those contrasts a little bit more. But it's and it's very much, as Susanna said before, showing rather than telling. You see these scenes, and the hope is that later on you think, oh yeah, you know, there was something in that.
I would still really like to know whether we could do a gender-swapped passion play, right? Whether Jesus could be played by a woman and what that would mean. Because there's something, and actually there's a sort of side comment there, which is that one of the things I was really struck by, having the privilege to accompany Helen and Shadab to one of the rehearsals and hear the conversations, was these tensions emerging behind, well, how would men and women have been in a very, very sexist, very, very hierarchical society? And how can we do this play? And that tension already appearing. So already in wanting to put some of these challenges about gender hierarchy, actually having to push things in a direction that the historical accuracy, quote unquote, big quote, big unquote, wouldn't go. And then I start to ask myself, well, okay, how about? Could we do it? And what would happen if you did?
So I have seen it done. And I did push it. You guys might want to answer some of this more, but I did push it a little bit this year in that I can't even remember how I decided, but I decided to have God at the beginning. And God was played by a woman in that. And I kind of figured, beautifully played by Janine, who's with us today. And I kind of figured, because I can't remember if it came from a discussion or something, and again, theologians correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there something right at the beginning of Genesis, let us make man in our image, God says. And it is not a male or female, I think, in the original. Yeah. Yes, both. So,
the vital point.
Yeah. So I figured I could do that. I don't know from the surveys if anybody objected, but I thought it was really powerful, and I hope Janine won't mind me saying. But Janine is visually impaired, and it's the first time we worked with a visually impaired artist, which was fabulous. And she just brought with her a vulnerability and an accessibility, and so not everybody would have got the fact that was God at the beginning. We didn't really name it. There was never Jesus speaking, but if you were looking at it, you could see all the time that Janine's character was always watching Jesus, even though she's visually impaired. She was always angled towards him in Gethsemane and the crucifixion, all those kind of things. The one that I saw was the mysteries. I think I might just the mysteries in London. And it was a production that was Old and New Testament. And God was played by a woman in Act 1, and it was fabulous, fabulous. Black woman, brilliant, loved every second of it. Act 2, when they get to the New Testament, she took off her coat as God and became Jesus. And it just didn't work for me. I don't know why, because I was open, I was already had it, didn't. And the place where it broke down most for me, this is a modern production, so they're in modern costume, was the crucifixion. I just couldn't get past that. And they didn't do it naked, chested. I mean, I think they had a bandana or something on, but I just could not get past that. And I'm fairly open in it. So would I do it only if I was doing maybe Old and New Testament together? I think for me, it's too much of a push to do Jesus as a woman.
It's just, I don't want to distract the conversation further. To me, there's some really interesting questions there around risk and experiment and the ways in which one can and can't, the limits of the malleability of these traditions, and what we can depict and what you can write, and how those might be different. So it plays back into a lot of the questions we've been talking about. I think Shadab has something further to say. It might be great to hear of final remarks from the panel part of the conversation, if anybody's got something that they're really keen to add before we open it up to the floor to pull some of the questions out further, please.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Very quickly, just to build on what you said about gender swapping and thinking about that in terms of the audience and the reception of the play and Livingston Street Gardens, I thought the responses in the survey were at times very intuitive and sometimes disappointingly intuitive, but other times refreshingly counterintuitive. So this is one of the responses that we got. Quote, "The bread-making scene with Martha and Jesus was really powerful." I should say that this is from a middle-aged man. "The bread-making scene with Martha and Jesus was really powerful. I like baking and sewing, and sometimes the social mores of today suggest that these are quote-unquote feminine traits," right? Now, the converse of that was an interview that I had with a middle-aged woman right after the play who was very upset that Jesus was portrayed in quote-unquote ways. Quote, "You made him look like a softie." Right? So this is really interesting. Men play a key role in propping up patriarchal constructions of manhood, but so too do women as well, right? So it was interesting to look for these counterintuitive responses in the survey itself.
That's fascinating. Thank you. But yes, Donald, did you have something else?
So just two little things. So I mean that portrayal, powerful understanding of Jesus as expressing feminine and feminist ideals has got a long route, going back into the Gnostic Gospels. But I mean, in the early feminist movement, for example, Marilyn French's Beyond Power, Men, Women and Morals, from a completely feminist perspective, has an astonishingly powerful analysis of the Jesus story as an expression of feminism. So, I think there's a whole rich, interesting thing there. I mean, all the conditions of performance and production condition people's responses. So, gender swapping. What if it was all in modern costume? That wouldn't work in the outdoor thing. But say it was done in this space, in contemporary costume, that would be a different sort of dynamic. And the last little thing, it just came to me when I was sitting, I was thinking, so why narrative? Why story? From the very beginning. So as I understand, probably the earliest Christian document was the Didache, a document of teaching. Just a record of teachings, perhaps, or whatever, early. Why, from such an early stage, are we in love with narrative? Is it probably Jewish Torah influence and a continuity of that. But it's so interesting that power of expressing and re-expressing through narrative is a continuity from the very beginning right up until today. And it still is evolving and rewarding, I think.
Can I just add a couple of things on that? I think that comment that Jesus is a softie, actually, it was. I can see where that came from. So this year, we tried to make the play as accessible and diverse as possible. This is the first year that we had a person of colour playing Jesus, and Michael was very soft and gentle man, actually. And usually, I really push the actors playing Jesus to find the power, all the colours of Jesus. But Michael brought his vulnerability and softness to it, and I think a couple of people have said actually he was a very gentle Jesus this time. And I don't usually have that. I usually go for the more powerful one than that. We have done modern twice, actually. Rob Archibald's one. It's harder in the setting of the gardens because the gardens look so beautiful, and the modern one. And we killed Jesus by lethal injection on a metal table shaped like a cross. So that was quite interesting. We'll see if we do that one again, I don't know. But there's also, it reminded me of, some of you may know or may not know, the play by Jo Clifford, who's one of the UK's top playwrights. And Jo Clifford is a trans woman who I know very well. And Jo wrote Jesus, Queen of Heaven. It was very controversial. I'm not about to go into, I could talk for at least an hour on that. But first of all, when I heard about Jesus, Queen of Heaven, I said, I'll never go and see it. It's just way beyond anything I can take. And then I know Jo, I've known Jo for a long time. I thought, I really need to go see. I don't think you can pass judgment on something if you haven't seen it. So I went to see it, and I was really touched by it. There were bits that I didn't agree with, and yes, there were bits that I struggled with. But when, in that play, Jesus is, because she goes, Jesus is made in our image, and I am a trans woman, therefore Jesus, for the sake of this play, Jesus is a trans woman. And Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son. And it's one of the most beautiful retellings of that story. And when the prodigal son comes back, the father says, put the best dress on him. Mm-hmm. And I just about cried, Do I agree with it? I get it. But for me, it was about that relevancy again. And I think that's what's really important.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Something that we didn't mention, we talked about kind of masculinity in contrast with Jesus. But for me, I thought one of the most interesting contrasts was actually with Peter. So Peter is portrayed in the play as quite like a macho man. He doesn't want to bake the bread. That's women's work. He wants to fight with Jesus. He brings out his sword and Jesus tells him to put it away. But then there's that really striking bit at the end after Peter has denied Jesus 3 times. He says something like, what sort of man am I now? And I thought that was really interesting that he was, that line in terms of kind of masculinity and it's kind of old school kind of honor and shame and male values, but it's also kind of something like standing up for what he thinks is right. It was a different kind of shade of masculinity rather than just kind of the kind of masculinity, femininity. It was something, I don't know, I thought it was really thought-provoking, and I just wanted to kind of bring that up.
I'd just like to say, why not give the feminine Jesus more of a go? You could get there from John's Gospel, the Sophia wisdom kind of stuff. Or at least more androgynous. You need a topic for next year, Suzanne. Just think about that. Anyway, that's it.
Did you want to add anything more about the play and the way?
No.
Because friends, we've got some time for wider discussion. We've ended with these questions around gender and masculinity in the play, but there's a lot of wider questions in the space, including about what we're trying to do with this kind of performance, how it relates to public theology and public spaces, and what the opportunities and risks seem to be a theme of what's been said here, and these performances as spaces of opportunity and risk.